Thank you very much. Like somebody else said, being the final speaker, a lot of what I'm going to say might have been covered already. But I thought I'd be a bit philosophical in my my talk. Heidi actually wanted me to, I wanted to talk about sugary drinks taxes, which is my favourite subject, and I don't think have had enough airing today. But Heidi wanted me to talk about the whole range of population-based interventions based on price, place, product and promotion. So I'm going to do that, but you won't be surprised to find that I do talk about sugar drink taxes as an illustration of one of those population-based interventions. I should say I come from a centre for population-based interventions on the prevention of non-communicable disease prevention now. So this is a subject I should know something about, but it's not. And I give lectures on, so there's a bit of an undergraduate lecture feel to it as well, sorry. Anyway, the outline of my talk is what is a population-based intervention, and then to try to give you a conceptual framework for classifying population-based interventions and thinking about them more generally, specifically in relation to the evidence for the effectiveness of such interventions and particularly their cost effectiveness, but then to broaden it out to more issues of affordability and impact of such interventions, and then finally some issues of practicality. So what is a population-based approach to preventing NCDs? This comes from one of my undergraduate lectures. I think it's a focus on shifting the distribution of risk factors in the population rather than those on the greatest risk. So it's not about targeting individuals who are at high risk of sugar consumption, say, or overweight and obese. It's about dealing with the issue in the whole population, the whole problem about sugar consumption, the whole problem about being overweight and obese as a whole in the society we live in. And secondly, I think it's a focus on distal rather than proximal causes of disease, or proximal causes of disease. So what do I mean by those two things? Well, some of you have seen this guy before. His name was Geoffrey Rose. He wrote this thing called The Strategy of Preventive Medicine, which set out the whole difference between population and individual approaches to the prevention of disease. And here's a slide illustrating his approach. Basically what he's saying is that in order to get the most bangs for our bucks, the best effect in terms of prevention, we need to focus on the whole distribution of risk within the population to shift the whole distribution of risk rather than just focus on those at the highest risk. A quick summary of a long bit I could give you. And the other thing is, the other distinctive feature of a population approach is to focus on distal rather than proximal causes of disease. This is a slide I pinched from Chris Murray, who was at WHO at the time, where he maps the causes of disease in this rather simple fashion. Obviously, it's a very simple illustration of the causes of disease. On the right, you have disease itself, then you have physiological causes, which Robert, for example, was talking about earlier. Then we have lifestyle factors like diet, and sugar would come within there. And then we are also interested in what causes high sugar consumption are the personal or environmental factors. This is what's known as a causal web, and another example of a causal web is this one, which you've seen earlier, a bit more complicated in the causal web. But somewhere in amongst that, you'll see things like price, or marketing of foods, or labelling, or psychological ambivalence for Jason. There's lots of different causes. But basically what you've got there is a more complicated version of here. Right, how do we look at the possible ways of changing the risk in the population, the levels of sugar intake that we have in this country, which I think most of us agree in this audience are too high? Well, there's ways of classifying these interventions, and the one I quite like is based on marketing theory, looking at the 4 P's of marketing: product, promotion, place and price. And you can divide the sorts of interventions we've been hearing about today in lists and in general terms into these 4 categories. So product, for example, that would be reformulation, which you've heard a lot about today. Or it'd be compositional standards, if you're thinking about more legislative approaches to the issue of reformulation. In the area of promotion, we're talking about advertising of foods to children, which Sue's just been talking about, and nutrition and health based. In the area of place, we're thinking about place-based promotions, how you use place to promote certain foods like gondola ends at a retail level, and you can think about that at a macro and a micro level either as well. And in terms of place, we're also thinking about what foods are made available in certain outlets, such as hospital vending machines we heard earlier. And then in price, which I think is an important thing, which we haven't really talked about. Price is clearly a very important determinant of food-related behaviour. We can do things at a voluntary level in terms of doing something about price promotions, which again Sue was talking about, or we can think about health-related taxes and subsidies. So this is one way of thinking about the vast numbers of things that we could do to reduce sugar consumption intakes in the UK. It's just one method of doing it, and clearly there are lots more things that you could add to this slide. Other people have thought of different sorts of ways of classifying population-based interventions. The 4Ps is the one on the left. The World Cancer Research Fund have come up with this nourishing framework, which divides the types of population-based interventions into a few more. I think, how many letters in nourishing? I've put them in the order which relate to the 4Ps. So they talk about not only consumption-focused interventions, but production-focused interventions, which we've heard only a tiny bit today in terms of agricultural production and trade. I think Jack was talking about some of those issues in one of the panels. But you could obviously do a lot about sugar consumption in the UK by regulating how much sugar we've actually produced in this country or imported, and that would be one set of interventions which you really need to consider as well. Then there are the 4P type things: compositional standards, labelling standards, retail standards, meal standards or vending machine standards in hospitals, say, advertising standards, and then economic tools like taxes. And then in the green, I put the three things that aren't covered by the 4Ps approach is things like information to consumers, information campaigns on a general basis or advice on a one-to-one basis. And the UK Health Forum have also produced a framework similar to these two frameworks, the Nourishing the 4Ps framework, in their recent, very good and commendable document, which came out at the same time as the Public Health England report in response to SACN, which I hope you've all read. And they divide them up into produce less, use less, eat less, sell less, market less, and recommend less. And there's a similar sort of way of doing it. But I think it's helpful to have some sort of framework for thinking about these things. Otherwise, it's just a list. How then should we consider population-based interventions? Well, how are we going to decide which ones should be priorities amongst the many? And actually, at this point, I should say I'm not suggesting that any one intervention is going to be the solution to all our problems. Everybody said, I think, that reformulation is not going to be the only thing that we need to do, but it's one of the things we could do. And similarly, I wouldn't actually suggest that sugary drinks tax is the only thing we should do, but I think it's one of the things we might do. So we need to consider these interventions, things at the level at which they're operating. So that could be national or EU or local even. The population groups that would benefit, are they everyone in the population or just the children, for example? Then some strengths and weaknesses of these types of interventions. The evidence for these interventions are clearly critical. Is there good or bad evidence for such interventions? And then possibly at some uses looking at how these interventions have been implemented in a similar context or elsewhere around the world. And then the last thing we need to consider is who to take action. So here on this slide I've looked at three possible population-based interventions. Product reformulation, which we've discussed a lot today, promotion and marketing restrictions of unhealthy foods, and price in terms of sugary drinks. And here I've done a bit of comparison between the three types of interventions, and I think this is the sort of thing we need to do if we're going to critically come to some decisions about which of these population-based interventions we need to focus on. We should say some of this is rather subjective on my part. I think the evidence for product reformulation is not very good, and I'll come on to that later, and the evidence for marketing restrictions on healthy foods to children and on sugary drinks taxes is actually much better. Anyway, coming on then to evidence of effectiveness. We've heard a lot about evidence of effectiveness in relationship to systematic reviews and the relationship between sugar consumption and health, but we also need to look critically at the relationship of the effectiveness of the interventions to actually reduce sugar consumption or intake in this country, regardless of its effects on health. And here I've listed a few types of evidence of effectiveness. Firstly, I think logic is used a lot in this this case. Actually, you might say that's anecdote. Then there's evidence by analogy. I think we can use evidence from tobacco and alcohol and salt in looking at sugar, and certainly that is done to a large degree. I mean, the evidence on reformulation with regard to sugar is largely based on our experience of reformulation with regard to salt, and maybe you may question that analogy. There are observational studies of determinants, so that's about whether things like price, promotion, product composition, etc., do actually have an effect on sugar intakes. Then we have some small-scale experiments in things like canteens and virtual supermarkets becoming increasingly trendy. And then finally, evaluation of natural experiments. I sort of say finally, because evaluations of natural experiments are really very important, but quite a lot of population-based interventions like marketing restrictions or indeed reformulation with regard to sugar content haven't actually been tried very many places in the world. And so evaluations of natural experiments are pretty rare to come by. And finally, we have modelling. And modelling is a sort of evidence of effectiveness. It's really using the results of some of these other sorts of studies to predict what would happen if you introduce an intervention in a particular population or society. So, in regard to those three types of interventions I showed you earlier, reformulation of products high in added sugar, or marketing restrictions of unhealthy foods, or price, can we look at the types of evidence we've got with regard to these types of evidence? So we have logic, I think, on all of our sides. We do have analogy from salt in the case of product reformulation. We have analogies from alcohol and tobacco in the case of all three. Observational studies of determinants. I think we've got quite really good evidence that marketing of foods does affect the diets of children, not so good on marketing to adults. We've got really good evidence that price is an important determinant of consumption. We have small-scale experiments in all sorts of three areas. We've got, for example, with regard to price, we've got studies in virtual supermarkets and in canteens and so forth. And as I said, natural experiments are pretty hard to come by, but we do have cases of marketing restrictions in places like Ottawa, where I think we can show an effect of marketing restrictions in that area. And then in terms of modelling, we've got lots of modelling evidence to look at all, or most of these types, but not so much the reformulation. What does this all mean? So cutting a long story short, can we actually come up with some rank order of the effectiveness of different types of interventions? More precisely, can we actually look at the cost effectiveness, not just the effectiveness of these interventions, in some sort of list? So here's my most favourite list at the moment. It's derived from, it's done by a researcher called Linda Kobiak as part of the ACE prevention initiative in Australia, where she's using the same methodology for each of these 17 or so different types of interventions. She looked to find out which are the most effective and which are most cost effective. And at the top of her list, and I think this is the best list, there are equivalent sort of lists, but nobody's really done this properly, really, until recently around the world. At the top of her list comes the 10% tax on unhealthy foods. And I should say, things like reformulation do come up very high and very cost effective. In other words, what I mean by dominant here is actually cost saving, rather than actually costing anything to avert a disease-adjusted life year in this instance. And down the bottom of this list, you'll see things like dietary counselling, which are very expensive in relationship to the benefits that you get. So, for example, dietary counselling by telephone costs 140,000 Australian dollars to get one disease-adjusted life year saved, whereas things like taxes on unhealthy foods, which actually raise money, not cost anything at all. So this is the sort of analysis I think we really need to do to get to grips with which interventions we're actually going to tackle. I just want to say a bit about the inadequacies of this sort of analysis, because it's all very well good saying something's effective, but can we afford it? So we know, for example, that if you were going to build a house, you might know that an expensive drill was going to do the job effectively and efficiently for you, but could you afford it? So some of these things may be very cost effective, and lots of public health interventions actually are, but would we be able to afford them in this country? So how do we define affordability? Is it just the predicted gross costs of an intervention in a particular population? And is affordability just a matter of pounds? For example, if we're looking at it from a government point of view, or are we looking at it from a societal point of view? And if we're looking at it from a government point of view, for example, the amount of capital expended is just as, or political capital expended rather, is just as important as the amount of money you're going to spend on something. So I don't think it's entirely possible to measure the affordability of some of these interventions in purely financial terms. They also depend on how far the rollout's going to be. So although a dietary intervention may be cost effective relative to drugs, dietary advice type intervention may be relatively effective compared with drugs, it's maybe difficult to roll it out across the whole population. And you can actually say the same as impact. So some things that may be very cost effective actually may have very little impact because they're only affecting a few people, for example. And finally, I just want to talk a bit about the practicality and feasibility of these interventions. A lot of the time, people looked at the evidence, said yes, they're effective. In most cases of public health interventions, you can say they're cost effective. They're really cheap compared with things like surgery and pharmaceuticals. But there are other considerations that have to be borne in mind when thinking about which of these interventions are going to be most practical and feasible. Firstly, I think alignment among stakeholders is really important. At the moment, you can see there is not an alignment about stakeholders with regard to sugary drinks taxes. I think the evidence clearly points to their effectiveness, but clearly there's a lot of disagreement out there whether they're politically acceptable or publicly acceptable or whatever. So the evidence clearly is not trumping everything. It's things like alignment among stakeholders. Similarly, also, I think there's technical constraints to some of these interventions. So, for example, I was interested to hear Luciana Berger's discussion about what they're going to do if they got into power, and that she talks about setting targets for compositional standards for breakfast cereals aimed at children. This, I think, is really technically difficult. I think it's almost impossible to define a breakfast cereal aimed at children, as lots of people have experienced. Is Sugar Puffs aimed at children? We know that Sugar Puffs are the main target audience, and main consumers of Sugar Puffs are men in their 20s and not children anymore, because they're not marketed to children anymore. And similarly, there are also, importantly here, I think, legal constraints to some of the practicality of some of these interventions. For example, setting compositional standards at the moment is the province of the EU. You cannot set compositional standards for breakfast cereals in Britain because of EU competencies here. So, obviously, I'm a researcher. I think that's all I had to say. Obviously, I'm a researcher. I think evidence should trump everything. I think we need to really have a much more critical review of the evidence for the effectiveness of these interventions. But we also need to look at economic evidence in relation to the cost effectiveness of these interventions, but we also look at some other dimensions of the practicality and implementability of some of these interventions. But having said, I think